Welcome, friends, to another discussion where we try to look past the headlines and understand the deep structural mechanics of the economic system we are living under, because something very significant has just happened in the United States Supreme Court, something that goes to the very heart of how capitalism functions in this country and how the political theater often distracts us from the economic reality. So let us be very clear about what has taken place regarding the tariffs and the former President Donald Trump, because the Supreme Court has handed down a ruling that is not just a legal technicality, it is a fundamental exposure of the contradictions within the American government's attempt to manage global capitalism. We have to start with the basic fact that for years now we have been told that the President of the United States has the power, the authority, and indeed the right to impose tariffs on goods coming into this country from China, from Europe, from Mexico, and elsewhere. And we were told this was necessary for national security. We were told this was necessary to protect American jobs. And we were told that this was a tool the executive branch could use whenever it declared an emergency. But now the Supreme Court has looked at the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is known by its acronym IEEPA, and they have said no. They have said that this specific law does not give the president the power to impose tariffs, and this distinction is absolutely crucial for you to understand, because it reveals the fatal flaw in the entire trade war strategy that has been deployed over the last several years. You see, the IEEPA was designed for something very specific. It was designed to allow the president to freeze assets, to stop financial transactions, to block trade in a way that sanctions a foreign adversary during a declared national emergency. And this is the key point, it was never intended to be a mechanism for raising revenue. It was never intended to be a way for the president to unilaterally rewrite the tax code, because that is what a tariff is. Let us not be confused by the language of trade defense. A tariff is a tax. It is a tax paid by the importer, which is then passed on to the consumer, which means it is a tax paid by you, the working class of the United States, and the Constitution of the United States is very clear on this point. In Article 1, Section 8, it says that Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Not the president, not the executive branch, but the legislative branch, the representatives of the people, theoretically speaking, of course. So when Donald Trump used the IEEPA to impose these sweeping tariffs on billions of dollars worth of goods, he was essentially bypassing the legislature. He was seizing a power that belongs to Congress and using a national emergency law to enact economic policy that had massive ramifications for the global economy and for your wallet. And the Supreme Court has finally stepped in after years of this money being collected, after years of this economic disruption, and they have said that this specific usage of the law is illegal. They have said that the statute does not authorize the imposition of duties or tariffs. It authorizes the prohibition of transactions. It authorizes the freezing of movement, but it does not authorize the government to say, you can bring this good in, but you have to pay us 25%. That is a tax. And the president cannot simply invent new taxes by declaring an emergency. Now, you might look at this and say, well, Richard, this sounds like a victory for the rule of law. This sounds like the system working the checks and balances, checking and balancing, but we have to look deeper. We have to ask why this happened and what the consequences are, because the scale of this illegality is staggering. We are talking about roughly $140 to $175 billion that was collected by the United States government under a legal authority that the Supreme Court has now said did not exist. Think about that for a moment. $175 billion taken largely from the pockets of American businesses and American consumers under a false pretense, under a misapplication of the law. And now we have to ask what happens to that money. And this is where the system really shows its true colors. Because in a just society, in a society that cared about the people who were wronged, you would expect an immediate and automatic refund. You would expect the government to say, we made a mistake, we took this money illegally, here it is back. But that is not what is happening. That is not what is going to happen, because the capitalist state does not give back money easily. The ruling creates a chaotic situation where the legal basis for these specific tariffs has evaporated, but the money is already in the Treasury. The money has already been spent or allocated, and the mechanism for getting it back is going to be a nightmare of litigation. It is going to be a field day for corporate lawyers who will charge exorbitant fees to help large corporations recover their losses, while the small businesses and the ordinary consumers who paid higher prices for washing machines, for steel, for electronics, they will likely see nothing. They will be left holding the bag, as they always are in these situations, because the system is designed to protect the state's revenue and to protect the interests of the large players, not the little guy who got squeezed by a trade war. He had no voice in starting. And we must also understand that this ruling, while it strikes down the use of IEEPA for tariffs, does not end the trade war. It does not mean that the United States is suddenly going to embrace free trade and open borders for commodities. No, quite the opposite, because the former president, and indeed the current administration as well, they have other tools, they have other laws, they can twist and turn to achieve the same result. They have the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, specifically Section 232, which allows for tariffs based on national security grounds, and they have the Trade Act of 1974, specifically Section 301, which deals with unfair trade practices. So while the specific weapon of IEEPA has been taken out of their hands, the war continues. The economic nationalism continues, because the underlying crisis of American capitalism that drives this protectionism has not been solved. The United States is still a declining economic hegemon, trying to use political force to maintain its position against rising competitors like China, and no court ruling on a technicality of the IEEPA is going to change that fundamental historical trajectory. But this moment is educational for us. It teaches us about the fragility of the legal structures that hold up the global economy. Businesses made decisions based on these tariffs. Factories were moved, supply chains were rerouted, prices were raised, and inflation was stoked, all based on an executive action that turns out to have been illegal. From the start, it shows you the arbitrary nature of state power under capitalism, where a single individual in the White House can disrupt the lives of millions based on a legal theory that eventually falls apart in court years later. But the damage is already done, the wealth has already been transferred, and the instability has already been injected into the system. This is the fatal flaw, not just of the tariffs, but of the reliance on the executive branch to manage the economy through emergency powers. We have seen a trend in the United States over the last 50 years where Congress has become more and more dysfunctional, more and more gridlocked. And so the capitalist class looks to the president to be the manager, to be the CEO of the country, to fix things quickly, to impose order. And so Congress has delegated more and more authority to the president, giving him these emergency powers, giving him the IEEPA, giving him the ability to act without debate, without legislation. But this ruling shows the limit of that trend. It shows that there is still a constitutional friction, that there is still a line that cannot be easily crossed when it comes to the power of taxation, because taxation is the lifeblood of the state, and the power to tax is the power to destroy, as the old saying goes. And the Constitution, at least on paper, tried to keep that power in the hands of the legislative body. So where does this leave us? It leaves us in a state of uncertainty. It leaves us with a government that has effectively stolen billions of dollars from its own economy and has no easy way to return it. It leaves us with a political class that is scrambling to find new legal justifications for the same old policies of economic warfare, and it leaves the working class once again paying the price for the hubris of their leaders, because make no mistake, when those tariffs were put in place, when the cost of steel went up, when the cost of aluminum went up, that cost rippled through every construction project, every car manufacturing plant, every appliance factory, and it resulted in higher prices for you, and it resulted in squeezed wages for workers in those industries. And now we are told, oh, oops, it was illegal. Well, that is cold comfort to the family that had to pay more for their necessities, or the worker who lost their job because their employer couldn't afford the imported materials. It is a spectacle of incompetence and overreach, but it is also a symptom of a system that is flailing, a system that is trying to use the blunt instrument of tariffs to solve the complex problems of deindustrialization and global competition, and failing miserable at it, because you cannot solve the structural problems of capitalism with a border tax. You cannot bring back the prosperity of the 1950s by simply taxing Chinese imports, especially when you do it using a law that was meant for freezing the bank accounts of terrorists and rogue states. It is a misuse of power. It is a misunderstanding of economics, and it is a tragedy for the people who are caught in the middle of this clash between the branches of government. Now we have to look at what comes next, because this story does not end with a gavel banging in a courtroom. It continues into the very fabric of our daily lives and into the future of this economic system that is struggling to maintain itself. We have to understand that this Supreme Court ruling is not just a legal decision. It is a symptom of a deep fracture within the ruling class of the United States, because on one side, you have the faction represented by Donald Trump and the economic nationalists who believe that the state must aggressively intervene to protect American industry from foreign competition, even if it means breaking the rules of the global market, and even if it means using laws like IEEPA in ways they were never intended to be used. And on the other side, you have the traditionalists, the globalists, the establishment figures who believe in the rules of the World Trade Organization, who believe in the free movement of capital, and who see these erratic tariffs as a threat to the stability of the entire capitalist order. And this ruling is essentially the system trying to correct itself. It is the judicial branch stepping in to say, wait a minute, we cannot have a single individual disrupting the flow of commerce based on a whim, based on a declaration of emergency that has no basis in reality. Because if we allow that, then no business can plan for the future. No corporation can invest with certainty, and capitalism, above all else, requires certainty. It requires a predictable environment in which to exploit labor and generate profit. But let us not be naive, friends, because while these two factions of the ruling class fight over the legal technicalities of how to manage the empire, while they argue over whether tariffs should be imposed by the president or by Congress, The working class is left completely out of the conversation. Nobody is asking you whether you want to pay higher prices for your goods. Nobody is asking the workers in the steel mills if they want a trade war that might temporarily boost their industry, but ultimately leads to higher costs for everyone else. And nobody is asking the consumers if they are willing to subsidize the profits of domestic corporations through these hidden taxes, because that is what a tariff is. It is a subsidy. It is a transfer of wealth from you to the owners of the protected industries. And this ruling does nothing to change that fundamental dynamic. It only changes the mechanism by which it happens. The tragedy here is that the American people are being distracted. They are being told that the enemy is China. They are being told that the enemy is Europe. They are being told that the reason for their declining standard of living is unfair trade practices abroad. But this is a lie. It is a distraction designed to keep you from looking at the real source of your problems, which is the way production is organized right here at home. Because whether a good is made in Shanghai or whether it is made in Pittsburgh, if the surplus value is being extracted by a small group of employers and used to enrich themselves while wages stagnate, then the nationality of the capitalist does not matter to the worker. The exploitation is the same, the alienation is the same, and the struggle is the same. And so we see the limitations of trying to fix capitalism with more capitalism. We see the failure of trying to use the tools of the state to patch up the holes in a sinking ship, because you can impose all the tariffs you want, you can declare all the emergencies you want, but you cannot stop the historical trajectory of a system that is built on contradiction. You cannot stop the fact that automation is replacing labor. You cannot stop the fact that corporations will always seek the lowest cost of production, and you cannot stop the fact that the gap between the rich and the poor is widening to a point that is simply unsustainable. And this Supreme Court ruling, while it may be a temporary setback for the specific strategy of Donald Trump, it is not a solution to the underlying crisis. What we need is not a debate over which branch of government gets to impose tariffs. What we need is a fundamental rethinking of how we organize our economy. We need to ask why decisions about trade and production are made by a handful of politicians and CEOs in the first place. Why don't the workers who actually produce the goods and services have a say in how they are produced and where they are sold? Imagine for a moment a system where the enterprises were owned and operated democratically by the workers themselves. Do you think a worker cooperative would vote to start a trade war with another country? Do you think they would vote to impose tariffs that raise prices for their fellow workers in other industries? Of course, not, because workers understand solidarity. They understand that their interests are aligned with the interests of workers everywhere, not with the interests of the capitalist class that seeks to divide them. So as we watch the fallout from this decision, as we watch the lawyers argue over refunds and the politicians scramble for new talking points, let us not get lost in the noise. Let us remember that the real issue is not the IEEPA or the Trade Expansion Act or the constitutionality of executive power. The real issue is that we are living under a system that prioritizes profit over people, a system that uses the state to enforce the will of the minority over the majority, and a system that is fundamentally incapable of providing a stable and secure life for the vast majority of the population. And until we address that root cause, until we have the courage to demand a democratization of the enterprise and a transformation of the economy, we will continue to see these legal battles, these trade wars, and these crises repeat themselves over and over again in a never-ending cycle of dysfunction. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the hidden mechanics of the tariff war, and I hope that this analysis helps you to see through the headlines and to understand the reality of the economic forces that shape our world.